Hello, and welcome back to your Introduction to Psychology class. In this lecture, we'll talk about the discipline of psychology. What do psychologists do? How do they do it? How do they think and answer questions? And what kind of topics do they cover? We'll talk about the major subfields of psychology, run over a very brief history of psychology, and distinguish psychology as a science. We'll talk about the scientific method, critical thinking, and cover some very basic statistics. Psychology is the study of human behavior and mental processes. What is behavior? A behavior is any action that can be observed or recorded, like a smile. Psychology also includes the study of mental processes, so your internal subjective experiences like happiness or sadness, which we could infer from your behavior. So we might infer from your smile that you're happy. Psychology is a science because it uses empirical, evidence-based methods. We make observations and conduct experiments. As a science, it requires a certain attitude, one defined by curiosity, skepticism, and humility. We can split psychology into basic and applied fields. Applied psychology is about using the principles of psychology, which would have been discovered and elaborated by basic researchers, to solving practical problems. Some examples of applied fields of psychology are educational psychology, that's about helping people learn; industrial organizational psychology, which is about helping people and organizations work more effectively; and forensic psychology. Forensic psychologists apply psychology to the legal field. So how likely is someone to reoffend? Is this eyewitness testimony reliable? Questions like that. SMU does have graduate programs in IO and forensic psychology, so if you want to study those topics, you're definitely at the right school. I'll note that if you are interested in different areas of psychology that other universities might be stronger in, for instance, the Mount has a focus on education and development, and Dalhousie's really strong at clinical, cognitive, and experimental psychology, you can get up to half your degree through transfer credits from other institutions. Basic researchers focus on developing knowledge of psychology, on determining fundamental principles. It's about understanding, on coming up with theories to explain people and testing them to see if and how and when they're right. If we look at all the areas that psychologists report practicing in, you can see that the biggest chunk are in clinical psychology. The different subfields of psychology represent different perspectives. Clinical psychology is distinct in that it uses a medical model for mental illness, which is like psychiatry. An important distinction between clinical psychology and psychiatry is that psychiatry is a field of medicine, and psychiatrists are medical doctors who can prescribe medications. Psychologists cannot do that. Clinical psychology and psychiatry apply medical models. A mental condition like depression is an illness that's described and diagnosed and defined by an authoritative text. And then there are approved treatments for that illness. So up on the slide are the diagnostic criteria for someone to qualify as having depression. They have to demonstrate that they've experienced 5 or more of those 8 symptoms during the same 2-week period, and at least one of those symptoms has to be depressed mood or loss of interest or pleasure. And those symptoms have to cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or some other area of functioning. So if you don't mind being depressed too much and it's not interfering with your work or other functioning, then that's okay. The medical model is a lens. You could look at alcohol use disorder as a medical or psychological illness. A psychiatrist might prescribe a drug like naloxone to make the effects of alcohol less rewarding, but a psychologist might help someone with mental side of things. They might discuss daily challenges, long-standing issues, past traumas that could contribute to alcohol use. Maybe the alcoholism is a response to depression. Maybe there's an underlying condition that needs psychological treatment. Psychology is a science because of its evidence-based method. The phrase, "the rat is always right," means that if psychologists come up with a theory, for example, that you can use pellets of food to train a rat to push a lever, the rat's actual observed behavior determines whether the theory panned out. We don't assert that something is true just because we want it to be true, or because we deeply believe it to be true. We have to allow that our theories are sometimes not supported by the evidence. And then we adjust our theories, and that's how science moves ahead. The scientific attitude involves curiosity. That means striving to explore and understand the world. Skepticism, asking questions like, what do you mean? How do you know? What are the assumptions behind that claim? And humility. And humility is about willing to admit when the evidence shows that we're wrong, and about being aware of our own biases. And that can be difficult. We'll always have biases. There's no value-free, objective, unbiased psychological science. Instead, the best we can do is to strive to be aware of them and how they influence our interpretations. And that's easier said than done because they are biases and they affect how we think and what we perceive. There are 5 components to critical thinking. We need to examine the assumptions behind a claim, appraise its source, discern hidden biases, evaluate the evidence, and assess the validity of the conclusions. That's quite an impressive skill. Critical thinking can lead to surprising findings. Sometimes things that we believe to be true aren't. It can help us identify effective versus wasteful or harmful policies or practices that look or sound good, and help us assess popular applications of psychology, by which I mean pop psychology. There's a lot of bullshit out there, both in academic and popular psychology, and you need the skills to smell it. Otherwise, you lay yourself open to be taken advantage of, or allow yourself to cause thoughtless harm to others. Parents who devoutly believe that they can cure their child's diabetes through prayer and discontinue insulin kill their kids. They're not thinking critically about their beliefs, which of course they think are true. Quality of thinking matters. Psychology is a crossover discipline between biology and philosophy. Historically, it's been driven by certain big philosophical questions. One of them is abstract truth versus empirical observation. Do we really need to observe and analyze data from the real world? Why can't we just speculate using introspection and reason? That's called armchair psychology. Philosophers long wondered whether the mind was independent from the body. Is your mind part of your body? Can it go on without your body? We now know that your mind is a function of your brain. Another really big question in psychology was nature versus nurture. Are we pre-programmed to think and act in certain ways? Or is your mind like a blank slate, having nothing written upon it except what you learn from your environment? Today we know that nature and nurture interact with each other to determine human behavior and mental processes. Nurture works on what nature provides. There were several efforts to raise chimpanzees like human babies, but they all failed, though apparently the human children learned some bad habits. There are some big names in the history of psychology, and we won't cover all of them. Wilhelm Wundt developed the first psychology lab in 1879. Edward Titchener studied the mind through the practice of introspection. So let's say that you have a rose in front of you. You could say, well, I smell the rose. So smell is an aspect of your mind. And you see the color of the rose and feel the texture of the rose. And all of those experiences represent elements of the mind. William James asked how those elements were adaptive. So if you can smell, well, what's the good of that? He wrote the first psychology textbook, which is called Principles of the Mind. The most famous figure in the history of psychology is Sigmund Freud. He was the father of the psychodynamic tradition, which is about how your behavior is driven by unconscious inner drives and conflicts. He studied the unconscious mind. Freud studied his patients and himself. He studied himself through introspection, and he determined from his own knowledge of himself that all boys go through a period where they desire a romantic relationship with their mother and jealously hate their father. That this is a universal law and foundational to personality development. That should illustrate the problems with overgeneralizing from personal introspection. Freud studied his patients with a technique called psychoanalysis. That's listening to someone talk, letting their mind go wherever it will in a process called free association, and trying to discern these symbolic meanings behind what they're saying. He saw neurotic behavior as a reaction to inner conflicts, as the way that the patient's trying to resolve the conflict. He believed that we had defense mechanisms that served to protect us from our anxiety over these inner conflicts. The only two psychological defense mechanisms that are scientifically validated are projection and reaction formation. Projection is when you, feeling uncomfortable with something about yourself, accuse someone else of being that way. Reaction formation is when you act the opposite of how you actually feel. You hate children, so you become a scout leader. You're nasty to the person you have a crush on. Now, some of these are real phenomena, like being in denial or dissociating. We know that dissociation exists. You know that you space out sometimes. But are you spacing out because it's a defense mechanism from your anxiety over inner conflicts that supports Freud's theory? That's a different question. Maybe you're dissociating because you're bored. Maybe you have ADD. Maybe you're tired. Repression is controversial. That's the idea that if something terrible happened to you, you can protect yourself psychologically by forgetting it ever happened. Some very serious miscarriages of justice happened in the 1980s when psychologists were dragging up repressed memories of childhood abuse. It's more likely that the psychologists put the memories there, but as a consequence of the scientific credibility of the psychologists, people got hurt, punished for things they didn't actually do. Another school of thought said, to hell with your memories and thoughts and feelings. Psychology only cares about observable behavior. We can reliably observe and measure, because that's ultimately what we want to control. The behaviorists Watson and Rayner studied classical conditioning, and B.F. Skinner is known for his research on operant conditioning. What do I mean by classical and operant conditioning? You may have heard of Pavlov's research with dogs. He trained them to salivate to the sound of a tone. He'd make the sound, and the dogs would salivate. Pavlov and his research assistants had noticed that even though salivation is supposed to be paired with food, the dogs would start salivating as soon as they heard the footsteps of the researchers in the hallway. I'm sure your dog does something very similar as well. He isolated this effect experimentally. He was able to train the dogs to salivate to the sound of a tone. And he accomplished that by teaching the dogs to associate the sound of the tone with food, because he had previously sounded the tone before giving them the food. This kind of research falls under the umbrella of behaviourism because we don't care what the dog thinks or feels. Instead, the dog's salivation, that's an observable behaviour, is objectively measured. And how many cups of saliva do the dogs produce? Does that make you want to be a research assistant? In operant conditioning, researchers teach an animal, often a rat, to do something, like press a lever to get a reward. The rat learns that performing a particular action is rewarded with food, and so long as the food is an incentive, the rat will go do that thing. Punishments like electric shock are also used to teach them not to do something. The rat's behavior is being observed and measured. The number of times that the rat pushed the lever is being counted. Behaviorism has its limitations. Clearly, thoughts and feelings do matter. Around the 1950s, researchers started using early computers. We might wonder how our memory system works. Cognitive psychologists study how information is perceived, processed, and remembered, and they consider the role of thinking and feeling in psychological disorders. What kind of cognitions, thoughts, does a depressed person have? I'm so terrible, it's all hopeless. And can we teach people more adaptive ways of thinking about themselves, the world? The field of cognitive neuroscience seeks to understand the brain activity that underlies thoughts. So when we have a certain experience or think a certain thought, what part of your brain is doing that? The 1960s also brought about the rise of humanistic psychology. Humanistic psychology focuses on the positive in people and their potential for growth. In the humanistic model, psychotherapy is about a conversation between the psychologist and a client. And notice how we're using the word client instead of the medical term patient, where the client can be coached to overcome issues and grow toward being their best self. Carl Rogers also developed student-centered approaches in education, which you've likely benefited from. And you'll remember Abraham Maslow, who wondered what people needed in order to become fulfilled. Humanistic psychology is closely related to the field of positive psychology. If you want to know how these fields are different, it's in that positive psychology is a bit more objective and scientific in its methods. Martin Seligman was a behaviorist who accidentally discovered how to make a dog depressed. In one of his studies, he taught dogs to escape electric shock by pushing a lever. The dogs were arranged in what he called yoked pairs. So each dog had a partner, each dog was connected to another dog, and the other dog received the exact same shock, but had no opportunity to turn it off. So both dogs in the pair got the same amount of this unpleasant stimulus, but one of them got to control it. In a subsequent experiment, Seligman tried to get the dogs to escape shock by jumping across a hurdle. So that picture there is of a dog in what's called a shuttle box. And in order to avoid the shock that's going to come on after the light goes off, the dog has to jump over that little wall called a hurdle to the other side. The lever-pressing dogs learn this quickly and easily, but the other dogs in the pairs, the ones who got the uncontrollable shock, just lay down and gave up. They'd already learned that there was nothing they could do. This shows the limitations of behaviorism very well. You can't understand those results without a cognitive model. The dog thinks matters. Seligman went on to write self-help books that applied principles of psychology to help people live their best life. Nature versus nurture is one of those big questions in psychology. Is an aggressive person aggressive for some biological reason? Say because they have some kind of aggression gene? Or did they learn to be that way because of how they were raised or something about the society that they live in? If there is a biological genetic basis to behavior, and we know that there is, then we can ask whether certain behaviors are selected for because they're adaptive, because they helped our ancestors survive, reproduce, and pass on those traits. Evolutionary psychology looks at the ways that we're alike. It's a very common cross-cultural finding that men tend to be more attracted to younger women, and that women tend to be more attracted to richer men, and considers how those behaviors might be adaptive in the context of our evolutionary history. Perhaps men with that taste left more healthy offspring. Perhaps women with that taste also left more offspring because their fathers were better providers. Evolutionary psychology is speculative, and you could argue that those are just so stories. I could come up with some other reason, and how can you disprove it? The SMU psychology department has a brilliant evolutionary psychologist. If you're interested in this topic, I encourage you to look up Marianne Fisher. Other areas of contemporary psychology include gender psychology and cultural psychology. Gender psychology looks at gender differences in human psychology, and most of the differences that we report are quite small. The psychological theories that we believe to be true of all humans everywhere across all time are in fact based on studies that were conducted in very localized times and places. Those studies are most often conducted with undergraduate students just like you. Can we be sure that those results generalize, that they're really about all people? Cultural differences teach us about the role of attitudes, values, and worldviews. Importantly, it makes us question what we call normal and abnormal. Until 1973, American psychology considered homosexuality to be a psychological disorder. And that reflects Western culture. Another highly culturally constructed disorder is ADHD. The rates of ADHD are very high in North America, but much lower elsewhere, where those same symptoms are less problematized or even seen as normal, or managed through classroom practices rather than medication. Psychology as a discipline, as a community of researchers and practitioners, is always embedded in its wider social context. Today's psychologists know that most objective differences between the sexes are small or very small, and often highly socially constructed. Yet, once upon a time, psychologists kept women out of the field. Mary Calkins established the first psychology lab that women could practice in at a women's college. And although she completed all the work with excellence at Harvard University, where she had to obtain special permission to sit in on lectures, she was not allowed to graduate with a PhD because of her gender. She did go on to have a fine career and became the first female president of the American Psychological Association. Margaret Washburn was the first woman to get a PhD in psychology, though she was barred from her supervisor's professional organization. She did become the second APA female president, and proposed in her book, The Animal Mind, that mental processes could be appropriate for scientific study. While that idea was frowned upon at the time, the study of mental processes is now an unquestioned part of psychology. Psychology uses 3 levels of analysis. We can look at a behavior or a mental process through a psychological, biological, or sociocultural lens. At the biological level, we might see that people with depression have low serotonin, That's a neurotransmitter that's important for mood, and consider treating them with an antidepressant medication that increases their level of serotonin. At the psychological level, we might look at their thoughts and feelings. People with depression tend to have global negative evaluations of themselves, of others, and the world. A psychologist might work with that person to teach them more adaptive ways of thinking. The highest level is the sociocultural level. We can ask, what environment is that person in, and how is it, or isn't it, supporting their success? What barriers are they up against, and how could those be wearing them down? Looking at a behavior or a mental process through all of those lenses gives us the most complete understanding. That's called the biopsychosocial approach. Let's talk about how psychologists think. Psychology is a science. That means it uses the scientific method, which is a process for asking questions and observing the answers. We start with a theory. You have some idea that explains something in the world. Let's say that I believe that more conscientious students perform better in class because they do the readings and listen and lecture and take good notes and incorporate feedback. Those are all the kinds of things that a conscientious student would do. Now, to test that theory, I need to make a hypothesis. There has to be a testable prediction. If I can't disprove my idea, how do I know it's wrong? And the best way to see if I'm right is to predict the future. It's a lot easier to come up with an explanation for something that's already happened. So I predict that more conscientious students will have better class performance. But now I need to be very clear about what I mean and what I'm doing. What does conscientious mean? And how am I going to measure that? Well, there is a personality test for the trait of conscientiousness. That's defined as the trait of being careful or diligent. So now my operational definition of conscientiousness is your score for that trait on that test. Now, what do I mean by class performance? That could mean a lot of things. Engagement, how much you learned, how much you'll go on to apply in your life, the impact that it'll have on others. Well, the easiest thing for me to measure is your grade. Then I would need to go look at that data. I'd need to look at the relationship between conscientiousness test scores and course grade. And maybe there is a relationship and maybe there isn't. Now, in reality, your grade or your score on that personality test could reflect a lot of other things. Maybe you just had a bad week and couldn't focus on any kind of test. I need to be aware of that when I make claims based on my study. And now, maybe students in my class aren't representative of all students in all disciplines all around the world. And maybe my results are just a fluke. My claim that more conscientious students get higher grades would be bolstered by replication, by more researchers in other contexts repeating my method and getting the same result with a larger and more diverse sample of students. We have cognitive biases that affect the way we think and perceive things. As scientists, we need to be aware of those. That's why critical thinking is so important. We have a natural tendency to see patterns in numbers, in clouds, in tree bark, in grilled cheese sandwiches. We tend to be overconfident in our beliefs, and we think we know more than we do. We look for confirmatory evidence and disregard information that would challenge our beliefs. We tend to talk to other people who agree with us and reinforce our beliefs. Things can make perfect sense to us in retrospect. Looking back, we can construct an explanation for why something happened. And we can convince ourselves and other people that it's true. It's much harder and a much more humbling test of knowledge and theory to see if you can accurately predict the future. Psychologists conduct research in order to answer questions. The most basic question is what happens, and the corresponding research method is called descriptive research. Descriptive research is about measuring something in order to describe it. We can do that through what's called naturalistic observation, just watching and recording what you see. I could watch children in a playground and count how many times they hug each other. I could say, children in a 2-hour play session give an average of 3 hugs. Naturalistic observation is expensive, it's very time-consuming, and it can invade privacy. People also act differently when they know that you're watching. Imagine if I wanted to describe nose picking, how often people pick their noses, and you were one of the people that I was watching. If you knew I was watching, you might do that less often than you normally would, and my results would be biased. We can also study people through surveys. I could just ask you, how often do you pick your nose? Surveys like that are much less expensive and can ask about private behaviors, but people might not be honest about them. You might report that you never pick your nose. Then there's the case study method, and that involves an in-depth interview with an individual to get at general principles. When do you pick your nose? Why? How much do you like it? What do you like to do with the snot? Since they're only based on one or a few people, case study methods can be biased as well. Case studies do not offer a very high level of evidence, and their results can be inappropriately generalized. Think about how Freud came up with principles of human psychology that were based on his own feelings about his mother. But if we interviewed a large representative sample of men and they all said the same thing, that would lend some credibility to his theory. That one didn't pan out, though. Another basic research question is, when does it happen? What else is this associated with? Maybe you pick your nose when you're alone. Psychologists use correlational research to see if two variables are associated, if they tend to happen together. The scatter plot there shows the correlation between grade point average and sleep. So let's look at a single plot point there. This person slept for 4 hours a night, and their GPA was between a 3.4 and a 3.45. That's a B+. And this very strong sleeper over here at 8.5 hours a night has a GPA of just under 3.6, which is actually also a B+. The scatter plot shows that students who sleep for more hours at night have a higher grade point average. You can see that in the slope of this regression line through the points. This is a prediction line, and what it means is that if we found somebody who slept for 6.25 hours a night, we would predict that their GPA would be whatever lines up with this point over here where my arrow is. It would be between 3.45 and 3.5. Here's another scatter plot. This one's from your textbook. Each point here represents people's average ratings of how scary or disgusting a particular animal is. Cats score at about 1.25 out of 5 on scariness, which is not very scary, and also have about 1.2 on disgustingness, which is pretty cute. Spiders have the highest average scariness rating, and lice have the highest disgustingness rating. Now imagine putting a regression or prediction line through that data. There is a relationship there between disgustingness and scariness, such that animals who have higher scariness ratings also tend to have higher disgustingness ratings. All of the really disgusting animals are also scary, even if, like spiders or maggots, they wouldn't do you much harm. There's a lot more scatter in this plot than the last one. This is a weaker relationship than the sleep and GPA relationship. Those points fell closer to the regression line. These points fall further away from the prediction line, which I guess would fall about there, though I haven't done the statistical analysis that would generate such a line accurately. Correlations can be positive or negative in direction. In the first scatter plot, in the top row, a higher score on the x-axis is associated with a higher score on the y-axis. That's like the hours of sleep and GPA graph. The more people slept, the better their grades. And if all the scores were to fall perfectly on the line, the correlation would be 1.0. And they don't. That looks like a correlation of about 0.9, which is very strong. The second graph shows a negative correlation. A higher point on the x-axis is associated with a lower point on the y-axis. Let's pretend that the x-axis measures how many fights you had with your partner, and the y-axis is how happy you feel. The more fights you have, the less happy you are. And if all the points were to fall perfectly on the prediction line, the correlation would be negative 1.0. The third image shows no relationship, correlation of 0. You can't put a meaningful prediction line through that data. There's no association between the two variables there. And we could pretend that that graph shows the association between, say, shoe size and grades. Correlations are about linear relationships. In the graphs on the bottom of the slide, the correlations would be 0. The initial negative or positive correlation is canceled out by the fact that the relationship reverses about halfway through the graph. However, there obviously is a relationship. It's just nonlinear. These nonlinear relationships are common in psychology. The Yerkes-Dodson law is an example. Now, the plot of the relationship between hours of sleep and GPA had a restricted range. It only went up to 8.5 hours of sleep. But now, what if it went up to 24 hours? If you started sleeping through class and meal times and study periods and tests? well then we'd expect your grades to get worse. And you might see an inverted U shape in the relationship. Arousal theory was based on that nonlinear U-shaped relationship. It's the idea that you perform best or feel best when you're at a sort of moderate level of arousal that's not too relaxed and not too wound up. Correlation does not prove causation. Ice cream sales are correlated with violent crime. Does that mean that eating ice cream causes violent outbursts? Or that having a violent outburst makes you want to get ice cream? No, the relationship, which is real, is driven by another variable, and that's heat. When it's hot, people commit more violent crimes, and they buy more ice cream. If we want to determine whether one thing causes another, we need to do an experiment. We want to predict the future and do so in very controlled settings where, to the greatest extent that we can, we keep everything the same except for the variable that we're manipulating. In a descriptive or correlational study, we're measuring what's out there without trying to manipulate it. But in an experiment, we actually manipulate the predictor variable. If I do an experiment to test whether getting more sleep results in better grades, I, as the experimenter, would bring you to the lab where you would sleep, and I might only allow you to sleep for 3 hours. I'd wake you up after 3 hours, or 4 hours, or 5 hours, or allow you to get a full night of sleep and wake naturally. Or maybe give you sleeping pills to make you sleep more. It's very important to keep everything as constant and controlled as possible in order to be able to isolate the effect to the variable that you're manipulating and not to something else. I'd make all the participants sleep in the lab so that I know that the data is logged accurately and that everyone's sleeping on the same bed and it's not due to some effect of having a better or worse mattress or a cat that sits on your face in the morning. In a medication study, say we want to assess the effect of antidepressants on mood, we need to compare mood in people who took the antidepressant to those who did not take an antidepressant. But we'd want to get the control group to take a placebo. A placebo is a fake pill, and that's because believing that you're taking a medication and being under the care of someone can make you feel better. It's a psychological effect. So if the antidepressant works, we should see that it works better than placebo. That's a single-blind study where the patient doesn't know what they're getting. But it's even better if the experiment is double-blind and the researcher doesn't know whether the patient's getting the drug or the placebo. Of course, the administrative staff for the study would know and keep that secret. If the researchers know that a patient's on the antidepressant, they might perceive the patient's behavior differently. If they have high hopes for the drug, they might interpret the patient's mood as better, even if that person acted exactly the same way as a patient in the placebo group. Finally, it's important to randomize the patients to different groups, say to the treatment or the control group. If you put all the sickest patients in the placebo group, the patients in the antidepressant group would look like they were doing better. Randomization doesn't guarantee that the patients in the two groups will be comparable at baseline, but it's the best method we have. What does random mean anyway? It means that everything, or everyone, has an equal probability of being selected. Imagine if I were to select 10 students out of this class to be in a group, say like a focus group, that I would study in depth in order to be better able to understand my students. If I picked 10 students at random, I'd hope that the group would be representative of the class. That's like stirring a big pot of soup before taking out a ladleful that contains all the things in the soup, from the oil and the herbs on top to the potatoes on the bottom. Now what if I picked a non-random sample? That's like not stirring the soup and only skimming the oil off the top. Say only selected the keen beans from the front row, or only the students that look at their phones in class, or only those who get A's or F's on tests. Now I'd be studying a group that's actually not representative of the class as a whole, and I would be inappropriately generalizing what I learn about them to make conclusions about everyone in the class. Things like that actually happen a lot in psychology. There's a concept that comes up in your textbook that I'd like to elaborate, and that's regression to the mean. Some things are more likely to happen than others. It's not likely that you will consistently have extremely bad luck. Let's say that you're on average an A student, but you have terrible luck this week and everything goes wrong for you. Your textbook spontaneously combusts and you get an F on the test. Not changing anything about your study habits or hours of sleep at all, your grade on your next test is likely to bounce back. Extremely smart people or very tall people are likely to have children who are less tall or less smart than their extreme parents and closer to the population average in height or intelligence. It's important to know about regression to the mean, otherwise we might think that things are changing or improving because of our intervention. If you come up with a workshop for struggling students and you pick the students with the lowest grades to participate, those students' grades are probably going to improve on their own, without your intervention. That's why you need a control group that gets, say, a non-academic intervention. If the improvement in your workshop group shows stronger improvement than the students in the control group, well then it starts to look like your intervention works. If you take a sample of depressed people and give them therapy or an antidepressant, well, don't get too excited about the improvement you're likely to observe, because that would probably happen anyway. Most people who seek psychological services are in a crisis state or at a low point in their lives. They'll probably bounce back, though maybe not as fast or as far without help. Psychologists cannot study or do whatever they want, however they want. There are ethical codes for the profession that are required to obtain and maintain a license to practice, though I will note that not all people who work in the field of psychology, notably IO psychologists, seek registration. Much psychological research is done on animals and generalized to humans. The costs of conducting research on animals are lower, and the experimental control that can be achieved is far higher. There are ethical review boards for research conducted with humans and animals, and as you might expect, the humans have more rights than the animals. Rats are a common subject for research on learning and memory, cats for research on vision, and fruit flies for research on genetics. What ultimately matters is how generalizable the results are. A cat's eye is similar enough to a human eye to warrant generalizable research results, but you wouldn't want to use, say, a fish eye. Now let's talk about some basic statistics, because a basic understanding of statistics is essential for psychology. People like big, round numbers. To be healthy, walk 10,000 steps a day. We often uncritically trust numbers that are reported to us. Myers and DeWall write, use critical thinking when presented with big, round, undocumented numbers. Perhaps ironically, psychologists are also subject to the biases that they research and teach about, and Myers and DeWall are no exception. In the textbook, you'll learn about the 10,000 hour rule, which claims that in order to become an expert at something, you need 10,000 hours of practice. You'll also learn that humans can remember 5,000 faces. If you actually look into the studies behind those claims, you'll find them questionable. We also easily believe graphs, and these can be misleading. In your textbook, the authors give the example of this graph, which shows which trucks are still on the road after 10 years. The advertiser's brand looks better, and the differences look major. But in reality, the graph zooms in on very small differences. Notice how the y-axis only goes between 95 and 100 on the really dramatic graph, but when the range of the axis is set to run between 0 and 100, the differences are much less impressive. Myers and DeWall will pull the same trick on you. In the module on sleep, you'll be presented with graphs showing the number of car accidents before and after people either gain or lose an hour of sleep. It looks like there are a lot more accidents when people lose sleep and a lot less after they gain sleep. When I pulled that data into Excel and set them on the same y-axis, starting at 0, well, you can see that the graphs in the text exaggerated the difference by using different vertical axes. They zoomed in on the differences. When I pulled that data into Excel and set both of those graphs onto the same y-axis that starts at 0, those differences looked a lot less impressive, though you can see they're still there. The graphs in the text exaggerated those differences by using different vertical axes, zooming in on the differences. To understand data, we often look at a distribution. Here's the grade distribution for the Week 1 quiz from January 2022. The x-axis shows the quiz grade, and the y-axis shows the percentage of students who got that grade. You can see that most students got some kind of a B. The average, that is mean, grade was 78, and the standard deviation was 12%. Your grade might not have been the average, might not have been exactly 78, might have been higher or lower than that. If you got an 80, your deviation was 2 points above the mean. If you got a 50, your deviation score was 28 points below the mean, and you should probably talk to me. The average deviation score across all students was 12, but that doesn't mean that your score fell 12 points away from the mean. That's just the average. So how do we describe and understand a distribution? We talk about center and spread. Now there's more than one way to calculate an average score, and what is the most appropriate measure of center depends on the kind of question you're trying to answer and the distribution of the data. Now let's say we want to know how old the people at that party are. One thing we could do is calculate the mean. That's 24, but nobody at that party is 24. The average is that high because one person is 95 while the rest are college age, and that pulls up the mean. The standard deviation is also huge. It's 19 years. But it sounds strange to say that the typical person there is 19 years away from a mean of 24. That's because, like the mean, the standard deviation is also sensitive to outliers. Without the 95-year-old, the range drops to 8 years, the mean would be 19 years, and the standard deviation 2 years, which looks more representative of the typical partygoer there. Excluding an outlier is one way that psychologists deal with that issue, but that's controversial. We get a better sense of the data by looking at the median and the mode. Let's put those numbers in order from smallest to largest. The middle score is the median, and an even numbered data set, you'd have 2 middle values and would just take the mean of them. Anyway, half the scores fall above the median and half fall below. It's the halfway point. The mode is the most common score. Here it's 18, because there's 5 values of 18. And it indicates that 18 is the most common age. Considering all 3 of those numbers and looking at the distribution gives you the best understanding of it. Let's go back to the grade distribution. It shows that most people got a score somewhere in the middle of the distribution, and a few got either a very high or very low score. It's not perfect, but there is some symmetry there. Now, there are a lot of reasons behind the grade that you get. One of them is how well you know the material, but then there are other influences. A very smart student could just guess their way through. A student with dyslexia would have a harder time reading the book and the test question. Or maybe a student didn't sleep well one night or was popped up on coffee. Or maybe something good just happened and the student was feeling really confident. Keep that in mind. Now, imagine that you're going to drop a ping pong ball into that strange contraption there. We'll strike a peg and then go at random with equal probability either to the left or to the right. And it strikes the next peg and the process repeats until the ball finally drops into one of the bins on the bottom. How do you think the balls will be distributed at the bottom? Will it be about the same number of balls in each bin? No. That is not what happens. Most end up in the middle, and fewer end up in the more extreme ends. That happens because there are more, equally unique, pathways to the middle. There's only one pathway to get to a bin on the far end. The ball has to strike right or left every single time, all the way down. For a device with 6 rows of pegs, that works out to being only one of 64 possible pathways. Yet, there are 20 pathways that go to the center bin. Let's think of your grades again. For you to consistently get very high grades means that fortune has favored you at many turns. You have the genetic gift of intelligence. You can afford the textbook. Your family values education. You have access to the tools and the time you need to study. You've conquered your anxieties and developed the skills of diligence and self-discipline, and you're on top of your calendar. A random variable is a variable, like intelligence, whose values depend on the outcomes of a random event. Random variables end up with a normal distribution. About 68% of scores fall within one standard deviation of the mean. 95 fall between 2 standard deviations of the mean, and almost all, 99.7, fall within 3 standard deviations of the mean. Intelligence is a variable with normal distribution. The average is an IQ test score of 100, and the standard deviation is 15. So 68% of people have IQs between 85 and 115. And there aren't many people with either extremely low or extremely high IQs. In psychology, we talk about differences a lot. Differences between individuals and groups. We'll say that men are better or worse at this or more likely to do that than women. When you hear about a difference in psychology, there are some important questions you should ask. First, is the difference reliable? Could the result of that study just be a fluke? Have other studies replicated the finding? Is the difference statistically significant? That means that even if the difference is small, it's big enough given the known variability in the data to look like a real difference and not just a fluke. Then how big is the difference? That's called effect size. There's big differences and small differences, and most gender differences we talk about are very small. There are standards for how big a difference is, for what we mean when we say a small effect or a moderate effect. A moderate effect is one that's apparent. You can see the difference in heights between 10 and 13-year-old girls. But many reliable and real differences in psychology are so small that they're hard to notice. Then, does the difference matter? It's actually a different question. A program that has a very small effect size that reliably reduces school bullying from 60% to 55%, as in the example in the table, might save someone's life. How do you make the call that that isn't worth it? Now, let's say we can establish the difference exists. Now what are we going to do about it? What are you going to do with that story? British psychologist Francis Galton discovered that intelligence was hereditary, and that there are individual and group differences in intelligence. What did he do with that story? He was an advocate for eugenics. He thought that those elements of the population who had lower IQ should be put in work camps, not allowed to have children. He inspired the Nazis. Incidentally, he also developed the correlation that we've been talking about, so be careful before you run with conclusions drawn from correlational research. On the other hand, French psychologist Alfred Binet knew that some students did not seem to benefit from a classroom education. He developed the first practical intelligence test, and he did that so that he could identify students who would benefit from extra support. Those are completely different things to do about differences. Thank you for your attention. As always, I look forward to your questions and comments.